The ancient city of Tyre stood on a small island on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, on the coast of what would one day be called Lebanon. It was, in those days, the greatest commercial city in the world, whose fleets traversed every part of the Mediterranean, furthering Tyre's astounding wealth and its military power. A city of the Phoenician people, a nation of expert seafarers and traders well known to the neighboring Greeks, Tyre once stood on the mainland until the old site had been abandoned in favor of a new settlement on the island it occupied now, a stronghold engineered to withstand any assault from land or sea. The new city stood about half a mile from the shore, towering over a channel below 18 feet deep, which made a harbor for its ships. Though tightly constructed and strongly fortified, Tyre was home to a vast number of magnificent buildings, the prizes of the riches and influence won over generations of successful business. Extraordinary tales of its grandeur were told by historians and geographers. It was said that the walls were 150 feet high, rising straight out of the churning seas below. The Tyrians had a storied past, stretching back to the early myths of the Phoenician princess Dido, who had left this homeland to found her own city on the coast of North Africa, which she called Carthage. And though Tyre now, in this era, in the later decades of the 300s BCE, was a wealthy, beautiful, and powerful city, it took little part in the tensions and maneuvers of rival powers around the Mediterranean. The Tyrians' aims were to keep their independence, and yet to remain on good terms with all the other nations on their doorstep, so the commercial enterprise that had made them famous would go on undisturbed. But a new challenge, and an unstoppable challenger, had arisen to the west. In the year 336, the young prince Alexander III had taken the throne of Macedon, a now mighty kingdom in the hinterlands north of Greece. Intent on advancing the work begun by his father, Philip II, before his death at an assassin's hands, Alexander had expanded the Macedonian army, tightened the broad control over mainland Greece first gained by Philip, and had soon set his sights on the greatest prize of all, a victorious campaign that would make him immortal. He would conquer the vast Persian Empire, the old nemesis of the Greek nations since the days when the old kings Darius and Xerxes invaded Greece, when the great battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis were fought. It was this string of victories and the enormous Greco-Persian kingdom Alexander would create in its wake that would earn the young king his lasting title, Alexander the Great. At this time, Alexander hadn't yet completed his conquest of Persia and was still on his way to the east, leading a well-trained, well-equipped army from his kingdom of Macedon into the domains of the Persians. It was now the year 332, and Alexander was moving south down the eastern Mediterranean coast after winning 2 major battles against the Persian Empire. And as he marched, another powerful city lay directly in his army's path, the island fortress of Tyre. Alexander's strategy was to win over the nations along the coast, including Egypt further south, before moving deeper into the Persian heartland. These lands had long been under the control of the Persians, or at least sympathetic to their rule, and he couldn't risk leaving a potential enemy to the rear. For this reason, the question of Tyre weighed heavily on Alexander's mind. It was a city with a long-standing, mutually beneficial relationship with the Persian Empire, and it had the ships and resources to pose a serious threat if he'd made them an enemy. On the other hand, he was well aware of the impregnable island the city occupied, with its massive walls surrounded by well-patrolled waters. A conventional siege was out of the question, since the Tyrians had better ships and more supply lines than the Macedonians could ever hope to cut off. For their part, the leaders of Tyre were fully aware of the danger posed by Alexander, and they wanted to avoid hostilities with his army at all costs. And so they tried diplomacy with the Macedonian king. They sent him complimentary messages, congratulating him on his conquests and denying any hostility towards him, going so far as to send him a golden crown to signal their acceptance of his rule. Alexander returned gracious replies to the Tyrians, but also made clear an intention of his as he passed through their territory. He wished to enter the city of Tyre to offer sacrifices to Heracles, the mighty hero and son of Zeus, whom the Tyrians worshipped in a grand temple. This request did not sit well with the leaders of Tyre. They knew well that wherever Alexander went, he went at the head of his army, and if they opened their gates to him, it could only mean that their city would soon be under his heel. So instead of agreeing to his visit, the Tyrians tried to divert him. They sent word to Alexander that it would not be in their power to receive him in the city itself, but that he could offer his sacrifices on the mainland, in the center of the old city, in an ancient temple of Heracles among the ruins there. Alexander, however, took this rejection as a clear sign of their allegiance to Persia, and became convinced that the island stronghold of Tyre was an enemy after all. Tensions gave way to open hostility, and finally to violence. Alexander instructed his generals that the expedition into the Persian Empire could only go forward when Tyre had been brought under their power, and he had become master of the Mediterranean coast. And the leaders of Tyre, sheltered behind their massive walls, outfitted their ships and prepared for the coming storm. Alexander understood the enormous challenge posed by the island's near impregnable defenses. And to meet the extraordinary challenge, he came up with an extraordinary and bold solution. After examining the site carefully, he set his engineers and soldiers to work building a broad causeway from the mainland to the island on which the new city was founded, constructed from the rubble of old Tyre, so that his army could walk straight across the churning seas and set up a siege of the city on stable ground. For all the ingenuity of the plan, it was a desperate attempt, demanding the builders of the bridge to complete their work under attack by the Tyrians in their city and by the ships patrolling the seas, which would only grow more intense as the builders reached the walls of Tyre. But still, Alexander determined to see the strategy through. Whatever the cost, the island stronghold had to fall. The sheer scale of the plan was astonishing. But Alexander's soldiers began the effort with courage and high spirits, eager to please the king in whom they had nothing but full confidence. Alexander sent parties into the mountains of Lebanon, where there were vast forests of cedar to cut down and bring back to the shore. The tree trunks were sharpened at one end and driven into the sand as a palisade to protect the workers from attack by water. Other soldiers brought stones from the ruins of old Tyre and threw them into the sea where the great causeway was to be built. The Tyrians watched from their island with confusion until the Macedonians had made enough progress to attract their attention. And the people of Tyre knew the moment to defend their land had come. Alexander's construction had to be stopped before the bridge reached their city. Ready to lay siege to the invading besiegers, the Tyrians built machines to hurl stones and heavy arrows over the water onto Alexander's construction. Releasing ships in secret, they made contact with allies who lived in the valleys and mountain ravines to attack the Macedonians at work there, and they landed troops from the city far along the shore to drive away the soldiers who were transporting materials from the ruins. They fitted large warships and sailed them to the bridge to assault the workers in close quarters. But nothing could stop the Macedonians, who carried on the effort despite the attacks from Tyre. Alexander built huge screens of wood on the constructed causeway and covered them with hides to protect his soldiers behind them. As the bridge advanced further and further out to sea toward the island fortress, more stations were added to it for throwing rocks and arrows of their own, and high towers were built on it that allowed the Macedonians to fire down on the Tyrian ships when they came near. After this, the Tyrians devised a new strategy: to destroy Alexander's works with fire. They took one of their largest ships and loaded it up with everything flammable. First dry wood, then pitch and tar, and then oil over the whole heap to make it burn even hotter. They soaked the sails and rigging and laid trails of combustible material throughout the entire ship, so when the fire was set in one part, it would spread everywhere at once and set the whole mass in flames in the blink of an eye. On a windy day, they towed the ship near to the Macedonian worksite on the side from where the wind was blowing strong. They launched the fire ship toward the bridge, and when the sailors got as near as they dared to go, they lit the fire and hastily dove off to escape. The flames flew in streaks all over the vessel, bursting into a massive ball of rolling flames fed by the wind. The blazing mass drifted into Alexander's causeway, unstoppable even by the desperate Macedonian defenders who struggled to veer it away. The towers and siege machines caught fire, and soon, with gusts of flame hurled off the Tyrian boat, the bridge grew into a massive blaze. Alexander's men tried in vain to protect their work, as some fell by arrows, some burned in the fire, and others fell headlong into the sea below. The army drew back, and all that could be burned was turned to cinders. Catapults, barricades, towers, and walls, leaving only the scorched, half-finished bridge of stone across the swirling channel. Not long after this, the sea itself came to the aid of Tyre, as the tides of battle continued to shift. There was a huge storm over the coast, and a heavy tide rolled in, which undermined and washed away a massive section of the Macedonians' bridge. In only a few hours, the raging sea destroyed the work of months. All Alexander and his men could do was watch from the shore, helpless against the tide, as the great stones and wood of the causeway crumbled off into the surging waves. But Alexander would allow no setback to stand in his way. When the storm was over, he picked up the work with new energy and sent his engineers and troops to repair the site and even widen it to better stabilize it. The Macedonians dragged whole trees to the edge of the causeway and sunk them down, branches and all, to the bottom, to form a broad platform that prevented the stones from sinking into the mud. They built new towers and siege engines, covering them with hides to make them fireproof. And soon they were advancing again, moving nearer and nearer to the city walls, more formidable and dangerous than ever. Alexander was still threatened by the Tyrian ships that controlled the waters and impeded his work, so he began gathering and equipping a fleet of his own to fight them. For this, he went north to the neighboring city of Sidon, and when the ships were ready, he led them on board himself as they sailed back down to the island stronghold of Tyre. Always innovating new destructive tactics against their well-matched foe, the Macedonians started linking their ships together with chains, 2 by 2, and building a platform between them that could carry soldiers, catapults, or enormous iron battering rams swung from a beam to smash the city walls. The perseverance of Alexander's army had worn the Tyrians down, and their hope of stopping a final attack was dwindling by the day. And so they decided to protect their people, to send women and children away from the city to Carthage, the ancient Tyrian settlement on the coast of Africa. They were determined not to surrender to Alexander, but would fight on to the very last. And they knew the end of this long, brutal siege could bring only death, enslavement, fire, and horror. In these final weeks, as the siege advanced, the two sides became more and more vicious. They treated the captives they took on either side cruelly, each side thinking they were avenging and outdoing the atrocities the other had done. The Macedonians on their makeshift causeway, a marvelous but terrifying construction, drew nearer and nearer across the sea. The resources of Tyre were gradually cut off, and its strength was worn away. Alexander's siege machines approached closer to the walls until the battering rams were slamming upon them, and breaches began to crack. When one huge breach on the southern side was found, Alexander knew the time to strike had finally come, and drew up plans to take the city at last. The Tyrians looked on from their crumbling defenses, and saw before them a terrible fate. But still, they would not give in. After all, at this point, after months of rage and loss of life, and with no leverage of their own, the Tyrians understood that attempts to surrender would do little good. All they could do now was wait for a storming assault by 30,000 soldiers and a determined, outraged young king, eager for the kill. The Macedonians would enter the city through the breach on the southern side of the walls, and ships were prepared with raised platforms to lift the troops into the broken section of wall. When the siege began, the soldiers rushed through the breach, clambering up to the battlements above to mount the walls. The Tyrians crowded the passageways in a desperate last stand against the invaders, cut down in the hundreds, and many falling headlong into the sea. The air was filled with a furious blend of belligerent cries and screams of agony as hordes of men were pushed in all directions, pierced by arrows, crushed by stones, run through with spears. Alexander's troops broke through the resistance, raced to the top of the walls, and then began descending again down the other side into the city center, which lay exposed and helpless. They poured down and spread through the streets, sating the hatred and rage against the enemy that had built for 7 long months of grueling siege, bursting into houses and killing any that came in their way. The mighty, prosperous, and ancient city of Tyre fell that day, drenched with the blood of its defenders and swallowed by Macedonian fire. After the invaders were tired from slaughtering the inhabitants, they found many who were still alive. For all his reputation for generosity and mercy in victory, Alexander punished the survivors with special malice. Many were executed, many were thrown into the sea, and some say that 2,000 were crucified along the seashore. With this victory, grisly though it was, Alexander's road south was clear, to Egypt and beyond, a path that would lead before long into the very heart of the Persian Empire, to a climactic battle between 2 rival kings for the fate of countless nations. The siege and storming of Tyre would go down as one of Alexander the Great's most famous exploits, a showdown between an impregnable stronghold and an unrelenting conqueror. It was a spectacle that saw the extremes of ingenuity, ambition, and perseverance, but cruelty no less. The memory of Tyre's fall and the great Macedonian causeway, like the life of Alexander himself, would leave a tale with much to admire and much to blame, but the most of all, to astonish and amaze. Welcome, folks. Here we'll have a little extra commentary on the tale of Alexander the Great's siege of the city of Tyre, one of the most dramatic episodes of his very eventful career. This is the first story about Alexander on the Wine Dark Sea channel, though at the time I'm recording this, there is now another one about his visit to the Oracle of Siwa during his time in Egypt. And I have no doubt at all that we'll be featuring plenty more stories about such an interesting guy as Alexander is. One of the particular ways Alexander's legacy is so interesting is how he became a sort of romantic legendary figure over the hundreds of years after his death, and even in ancient times he was already viewed as a kind of demigod, a figure who was cut from the same cloth as the great mythological heroes of the past. This kind of heroic character is also something that Alexander himself really tried to play up in his own self-representation. And the siege of Tyre, this massive effort against a near impregnable city, did a lot to inspire that kind of myth-making around him. For this commentary on the story, we can chat a bit more about the city of Tyre and its really illustrious history, and about how Alexander comes across in this record of events. This story comes from one of the relatively earlier arcs of Alexander's career as King of Macedon, in the early stages of his big campaign into the Persian Empire, which would include the detour down into Egypt, and then trekking all the way through Persia, winning battle after battle, and even further into India before the army finally said, "Enough is enough, we're done heading east," and they finally turned back west to go back home. But as the story lays out, Alexander first had to deal with the Persian territories that were along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, all those territories on the Levant, who had varying degrees of relationship with the Persian Empire, having lived and done business under the Persians for a long time. And Alexander, being a good tactician, didn't want to just sort of blaze a trail eastward while leaving potential enemies at his back, and this is what leads him into conflict with the city of Tyre. Now, as mentioned a bit in the story itself, the city of Tyre was one of the great capitals of the Phoenician people. And the Phoenicians had been around for a long, long time, known from at least around 600 years before Alexander, and while they never really became politically dominant, they were very, very important in terms of trade. They were some of the great connectors in the ancient world. They spurred on a lot of cross-cultural and linguistic exchange through their trading and their seafaring, and founding lots of outposts and cities around the rim of the Mediterranean Sea. You can see some of this exchange in the gods and heroes that the Phoenicians have in their myths, which share attributes or identities in common with Greek gods and heroes, seeming to reflect some shared mythological roots way back in time. So when Alexander in this story goes to worship in the temple of Heracles, this will be Heracles for the Greeks, but for the Phoenicians this would be Melkart, a hero who was renowned for strength, a demigod who was really an equivalent to Heracles, another divine hero who was famed for his travels, for conquering monsters, and founding civilization. So these are the Phoenicians, the people Alexander is going to war against in this story. And Tyre was one of their great capital cities, as was Sidon, another neighboring city. And you can still visit the ruins of Tyre if you go there today. If you want to hear about another Phoenician colony that becomes especially important in the history of ancient Rome, go on over and take a listen to the story of Aeneas and Dido if you haven't yet, which involves the big city of Carthage. In mythology, the Phoenician queen Dido, who comes from Tyre, is the one who sails over to North Africa and sets up the city of Carthage, which becomes a real powerhouse of Mediterranean trade and politics, and eventually ends up fighting big wars against the Romans. All this is to say that Alexander, when he's picking this fight against the city of Tyre here, is facing a very ancient and very formidable foe. And it's obvious from the story itself that both sides of the battle were a force to be reckoned with. The tale of the siege of Tyre has become especially famous for all the reasons emphasized in the story itself. You have an amazing set-piece battle around this impregnable fortress at sea, and the determination and ingenuity to build this giant causeway across the sea to attack the city. There's a lot to capture the imagination here, and make this event so memorable for ancient storytellers, and modern ones too. It really showcases the novel approach that Alexander and his generals would take to solving problems, like a lot of other famous military commanders in history who could think outside the box. Alexander was one of these who really thought outside the box, and never hesitated to make use of clever strategies to get things done. Now, the story of the Siege of Tyre is also really good for showcasing Alexander's character. How on the one hand you get this image of an enlightened, intelligent, charismatic leader, but also, as you hear at the end of the story, someone who could be exceedingly brutal as well. And there are plenty of examples of this side of his personality in the course of his campaigns. One of the earliest examples of this tendency for collective punishment against enemy cities is actually inflicted against Greece itself. Not all of the Greek city-states were content with the rule of the Macedonian kingdom that they fell under in the decades before, under Alexander's father Philip II. And when Alexander took the throne, transitions of power are a vulnerable time, so there was an effort among some of these Greeks to stage a rebellion to try to free themselves from the Macedonians. And the city of Thebes took this kind of stand early in Alexander's reign. But Alexander put down this revolt really hard, not just executing the leaders of it, but actually destroying the whole city of Thebes. This is in the year 335, just a few years before this story at Tyre takes place. And Alexander, who destroys cities, makes another appearance too while he's on campaign against the Persians in the year 330, when he captures one of the great Persian capital cities called Persepolis. And judging by the ruins of Persepolis that we have in modern-day Iran today, this was a magnificent place. But during Alexander's occupation, the city was burned down to the ground. So Alexander's brutality was just as much a part of him as his more appealing sides. You have the brutal warlord on the one hand, but on the other, also this sort of sensitivity and leniency toward the people that he conquered a lot of the time. Alexander is a really complicated and contradictory figure, somebody who is both magnanimous and open-minded, but also somebody who could be vengeful and destructive on the scale of entire cities. It's just one thing among a lot of things that make Alexander such an interesting person to study. Okay, that will do it for this commentary. Much like the heroic resistance of Tyre, this commentary must also come to an end. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. If there are any more questions you have about the story, feel free to post away. And as always, thank you very, very much for your patronage and supporting the channel. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one. And remember to watch out for flaming ships that might burn down your causeway, especially in high wind.